July 1944. 1 month after D-Day. The largest invasion in history has succeeded in landing on the beaches of Normandy, but now the Allied advance has ground to a complete halt. Not because of German tanks. Not because of artillery. Not because of elite SS divisions. The unstoppable American and British armies have been stopped by something far more mundane: hedgerows. Thick walls of earth and vegetation that have divided Norman farmland for 1,000 years. These ancient farm boundaries, called bocage by the French, have become the perfect defensive terrain for the retreating German army. Each hedgerow is like a natural fortress, 6 to 10 feet high, with roots so dense and earth so packed that they might as well be concrete walls. Between the hedgerows are small fields, maybe 50 yards across. The Norman countryside is a checkerboard of these tiny enclosed fields, each one a potential kill zone. German soldiers hide behind the hedgerows with machine guns and panzerfausts. When American tanks try to climb over the earthen walls, they expose their thin belly armor, and German anti-tank teams destroy them one after another. When infantry tries to advance, they're cut down by machine guns firing from 3 sides. Every field is a separate battle. Every hedgerow is a separate fortress. The Americans are gaining maybe a mile per day at a cost of thousands of casualties. At this rate, it will take years to break out of Normandy. Eisenhower is furious. His generals are desperate. The Allies have air superiority, naval supremacy, more tanks, more men, more of everything except a way through these damned hedgerows. Engineers try explosives. They blow gaps in the hedgerows, but it takes too long and alerts the Germans. They try bulldozers, but the hedgerows are too thick and the dozer blades just push uselessly against packed earth and centuries-old roots. They try going around, but there are hedgerows everywhere, thousands of miles of them crisscrossing the entire Norman countryside. The breakout from Normandy, the entire Allied strategy for winning the war, is failing because of farm fences. And then a sergeant from Tennessee, a farm boy who knew tractors better than tanks, has an idea so simple, so obvious, that every military engineer will wonder why they didn't think of it first. To understand the crisis facing the Allies in July 1944, you need to understand the bocage. These weren't ordinary hedges. The bocage of Normandy had been there for over 1,000 years. Norman farmers had created them by piling earth into walls at the edges of their fields, then planting dense vegetation on top: hawthorn, brambles, oak trees, all tangled together in an impenetrable mass. Over centuries, the roots grew deep into the earth walls, binding the soil into something almost as hard as concrete. The walls were typically 4 to 6 feet thick at the base and 6 to 10 feet high. Some were even taller. The vegetation on top added another several feet of thorny, tangled growth. The result was a defensive terrain that military engineers couldn't have designed better if they'd tried. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army, later called the bocage the most difficult terrain we encountered in the entire European theater. Each hedgerow enclosed field was a separate compartment, maybe 40 to 80 yards on a side. There were estimated to be over 4,000 of these small fields per square mile in the bocage country. That's not a typo, 4,000 natural fortresses per square mile. For the defending Germans, it was paradise. They could hide behind the hedgerows, invisible from the air and from ground observation. They could set up machine gun positions with interlocking fields of fire. They could wait until American tanks tried to climb the hedgerows, then hit them when they were most vulnerable. For the attacking Americans, it was a nightmare. Normal military tactics didn't work. You couldn't see the enemy until you were on top of them. You couldn't use your superior numbers because only a few men could fight in each small field at a time. You couldn't use artillery effectively because you couldn't see your targets. And most critically, you couldn't use tanks the way they were meant to be used, for rapid breakthrough and exploitation. American Sherman tanks would approach a hedgerow, rev their engines, and try to climb up and over. As the tank tilted upward, climbing the earthen wall, its thin belly armor became exposed. German soldiers with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, hiding just on the other side of the hedgerow, would wait for this exact moment. One shot to the exposed belly and the Sherman would explode in flames. Tank after tank was lost this way. Tank crews started calling the hedgerows death traps. Some tanks tried to push through the hedgerows instead of over them. The Sherman would rev its engine, drop into low gear, and push against the earthen wall with its blade. But the 1,000-year-old roots and packed earth wouldn't budge. The tank would sit there, engine screaming, tracks churning, going nowhere, a perfect target for German anti-tank guns. Other tanks tried to find gaps or gateways between fields. But the Germans watched these natural choke points, and any tank trying to squeeze through would be hit from multiple positions. By late June 1944, the Americans had been fighting in the Bocage for 3 weeks and had advanced less than 10 miles inland from the beaches. Casualties were mounting. Tank losses were unsustainable. And German reinforcements were arriving faster than the Allies could advance. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in Normandy, reported to Hitler that the Bocage was defending itself and that every field was costing the Americans rivers of blood. He was right. Something had to change, or the Normandy invasion would fail. His name was Curtis Culin Jr., and he was a sergeant in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't an inventor. He was a farm boy from Tennessee who had grown up driving tractors and fixing farm equipment during the Depression. Before the war, Culin had never traveled more than 50 miles from his hometown. He'd never finished high school. His entire technical education consisted of helping his father maintain a small farm's equipment with whatever scrap metal and spare parts they could find. But Culin understood something that MIT-educated military engineers didn't. He understood how to cut through tough vegetation and hard-packed earth. He'd spent his teenage years clearing fields in Tennessee, dealing with tree stumps, root systems, and rocky soil. In mid-July 1944, Culin was watching yet another Sherman tank fail to get through a hedgerow. The tank was stuck halfway through, engine roaring, track spinning, going nowhere. Germans were starting to range in with mortars, and the tank crew was about to become another casualty statistic. And Culin thought, this is exactly like trying to push through a tree stump with a tractor blade. You can't just push. You need to cut underneath first. Back in Tennessee, when his father needed to remove an old tree stump, they didn't just push at it with the tractor. That never worked. Instead, they'd weld steel teeth or prongs onto the front of the tractor, improvised tusks that could dig under the stump, cutting through roots, so the tractor could then lift and push the stump out. It was simple physics: cut the roots first, then the stump becomes movable. Culin looked at the Sherman tank stuck in the hedgerow and realized the hedgerow was just a really big stump. The tank was pushing against centuries of root growth, trying to move thousands of pounds of tangled vegetation and compacted earth. Of course, it wasn't working. But what if you gave the tank teeth? What if you welded steel prongs onto the front of the Sherman that could dig into the hedgerow at ground level, cutting through the roots and earth, so the tank could then push through? Culin sketched his idea on a scrap of paper and showed it to his unit's maintenance sergeant. The man looked at it and said something like, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever seen." Those prongs will just get stuck or break off. But Culin was persistent. He'd seen it work on Tennessee farms 100 times. "Give me some scrap steel and a welder," he said, "and I'll prove it works." The maintenance sergeant finally agreed, probably just to shut Culin up. They scrounged steel from a destroyed German roadblock, iron rail obstacles that the Germans had placed on the beaches to stop landing craft. These rails were strong, heavy steel, already cut into convenient lengths. Culin and a couple of other soldiers welded 4 of these steel rails onto the front of a Sherman tank, pointing forward and slightly downward, like tusks on a prehistoric beast. The result looked absolutely ridiculous. The tank now had what looked like giant fork tines sticking out its front. It looked like someone had stuck pitchforks on a tank. Officers who saw it laughed. But then they tried it. The modified Sherman approached a hedgerow, a thick one that had stopped multiple tanks before. The driver revved the engine, dropped into low gear, and drove forward. The steel prongs bit into the base of the hedgerow, digging into the earth and root mass. The tank kept pushing. There was a moment of resistance, then the steel prongs cut through the ancient roots like knives through rope. The hedgerow's structural integrity collapsed. And the Sherman simply drove through, pushing the cut vegetation aside like a curtain. The entire operation took about 15 seconds. Observers stood in stunned silence. They'd been fighting these hedgerows for a month, losing dozens of tanks and hundreds of men. And this hillbilly sergeant from Tennessee had just solved the problem with some welded scrap metal. Word spread fast through the American ranks. There was a tank that could cut through hedgerows. Officers came to watch demonstrations. At first, many were skeptical. Sure, it worked on one hedgerow, but would it work consistently? Would the prongs break? Would they get stuck? Would the modification weaken the tank's armor? They tested Culin's design on hedgerow after hedgerow. It worked every single time. The steel prongs cut through roots and earth, the tank pushed through, and within seconds the Sherman was in the next field. No climbing. No exposing the belly armor. No getting stuck. Culin's device did exactly what it was supposed to do. General Omar Bradley himself came to see a demonstration. He watched a modified Sherman cut through 5 hedgerows in quick succession, each time emerging into the next field ready to fight. Bradley immediately understood the implications. This wasn't just a useful modification. This was a war winner. With these devices, American tanks could finally move through the blockage at speed. They could break through German defensive positions before the Germans could react. They could exploit breakthroughs and turn tactical victories into strategic advances. This device, which soldiers were starting to call the Rhino because of its horn-like tusks, could break the stalemate in Normandy. Bradley issued orders immediately: modify every tank in Normandy. But there was a problem. The Americans had roughly 5,000 tanks in Normandy in mid-July 1944. Culin's design required about 60 pounds of steel per tank, cut to specific lengths, welded at specific angles. Where were they going to get 300,000 pounds of steel and the equipment to fabricate thousands of these devices? The answer came from an unexpected source: Hitler's Atlantic Wall. When the Germans had built their beach defenses in preparation for an Allied invasion, they'd placed thousands of steel obstacles along the beaches: hedgerows, Czech hedgerows, steel rails, and other anti-landing craft barriers. These were made of high-quality steel, already cut into convenient lengths. And now they were just sitting on the beaches, no longer needed because the Allies had already landed. The beaches of Normandy became a salvage yard. Work crews cut up German beach obstacles and trucked the steel inland. Ordnance units set up field workshops with welding equipment. Working around the clock, they began modifying Sherman tanks as fast as they could pull them off the front lines. The fabrication process became remarkably efficient. A team of welders could modify a Sherman in about 2 hours. They'd weld for steel prongs onto the front hull, angled slightly downward, reinforced with crossbars. The design varied slightly from unit to unit. Some had 4 prongs, some had 6, some angled them differently, but they all followed Culin's basic principle: cut through the roots at ground level, then push through. By late July 1944, hundreds of modified Shermans were returning to frontline units. Soldiers started calling them Rhino tanks or hedge cutters. The effect on morale was immediate and dramatic. Tank crews who had been terrified of the hedgerows suddenly became confident. They had a tool that worked. They could attack instead of being sitting ducks. Infantry loved the Rhino tanks because they could finally advance with armor support. Before, tanks couldn't help them in the bockage fighting. Now, tanks could cut through hedgerows and provide fire support in the next field within seconds. German after-action reports from this period suddenly start mentioning American tanks with cutting devices and unexpected rapid breakthrough. German commanders didn't understand what had changed. American tactics hadn't changed. American numbers hadn't increased that much. But suddenly American tanks were moving through the bockage like it wasn't even there. On July 25, 1944, the Americans launched Operation Cobra, the massive offensive designed to finally break out of Normandy. Over 2,400 Allied aircraft carpet-bombed a narrow corridor of German defenses. Then the ground attack began, spearheaded by hundreds of Sherman tanks. Many of those Shermans now had Rhino devices welded to their fronts. The Germans were prepared for an American attack. They had defensive positions in depth, artillery pre-registered on likely attack routes, and experienced troops holding critical terrain. What they weren't prepared for was tanks that ignored the bockage. German defensive doctrine in Normandy relied on the hedgerows to canalize American attacks, forcing the Americans to advance along predictable routes where German defenses were strongest. But Rhino tanks didn't follow roads or gateways. They cut straight through hedgerows, advancing across country in directions the Germans hadn't thought possible. A German machine gun team would set up to cover a gateway between fields, with interlocking fire from adjacent positions. This had worked perfectly for a month. Any American tank trying to come through that gateway would be destroyed. Then a Rhino tank would simply cut through the hedgerow 50 yards away from the gateway, bypass the prepared defenses, and be behind the German position before they could react. German after-action reports describe chaos and inability to establish defensive lines. Positions that should have held for days were being overrun in hours. The Rhino tanks were breaking through so fast that German artillery couldn't keep up. By the time German forward observers called in artillery coordinates, the American tanks had already cut through to the next field. One German officer reported that American tanks appeared to be able to move through solid earth. The psychological effect was enormous. German soldiers had been confident that the bockage made Normandy nearly impossible to attack. Now that natural advantage was gone. The Americans could advance anywhere, anytime. There was nowhere to hide. The Rhino modification also solved a critical tactical problem: coordination between tanks and infantry. In normal bockage fighting, tanks and infantry couldn't support each other effectively. Tanks would be in one field, infantry in another, separated by a hedgerow that might as well have been a wall. Now, tanks could cut through to the next field in seconds, staying with the infantry, providing immediate fire support. American infantry tactics in Normandy changed almost overnight. Before the Rhino, infantry would advance slowly, clearing each field in a dangerous, time-consuming process. Now, tactics became, send the Rhino tank through first to cut an entrance, follow with infantry, use the tank to suppress any German positions, clear the field, and move to the next one. Speed increased by an order of magnitude. Within days of Operation Cobra's start, American forces had broken through the German defensive crust. Tank columns exploited the breakthrough, racing south and east. By August 1st, American armored divisions had advanced over 30 miles, more progress in 1 week than they'd made in the entire previous month. The Normandy breakout was succeeding, and the Rhino tank was a crucial reason why. Not every tank had a Rhino device, probably only about 60% of American tanks were modified by the end of July. But that was enough. The modified tanks would lead advances, cutting through hedgerows to create paths that unmodified tanks and other vehicles could follow. By mid-August 1944, German forces in Normandy were in full retreat. The Falaise pocket was forming an encirclement that would destroy much of the German army in France. And those German soldiers who survived would report that one of the most demoralizing aspects of the American attack was seeing tanks eat through hedgerows like they were paper. After the success of Operation Cobra, the US military wanted to recognize the genius who had invented the Rhino device. There was just one problem: nobody was quite sure who that was. Sergeant Curtis Culin had definitely created a working hedgerow cutter and demonstrated it successfully. But once Bradley ordered mass production, multiple units started making their own versions. Some officers claimed their men had invented similar devices independently. Some units made improvements to Culin's original design. There were disputes about who deserved credit. The Army eventually decided that Culin deserved primary recognition for the invention. In October 1944, he was awarded the Legion of Merit for his innovation. The citation read, "For exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services." Sergeant Culin designed and supervised the construction of a hedge-cutting device which subsequently proved highly successful and was widely adopted throughout the theater. But Culin always insisted he didn't invent anything new. "I just did what any farmer would do," he said in later interviews. "Back home, we'd been cutting through tough roots and stumps for years. I just applied the same principle to hedgerows." He was also characteristically modest about the impact. "A lot of men had the same idea," he said. "I just happened to be the first one to actually build it and show it to the right people." This modesty was typical of Culin. He never sought publicity or fame. After the war, he returned to Tennessee and lived quietly, rarely talking about his role in Normandy. Some historians have questioned whether Culin should get all the credit. They point out that similar devices were developed independently by other soldiers around the same time. A corporal in another unit developed a different hedgerow cutter using salvaged steel. A tank company commander designed a blade-based system. Several units experimented with various modifications. This is probably true. The blockage problem was so severe and so obvious that multiple people were working on solutions simultaneously. Culin's contribution was being first, demonstrating effectiveness convincingly, and getting the attention of high-ranking officers who could authorize mass production. It's also worth noting that the Rhino device wasn't a sophisticated invention. It was basically 4 or 6 steel prongs welded to a tank. Any competent welder could make one. The genius wasn't in the complexity, it was in the simplicity. Culin understood that you didn't need a complicated solution. You just needed to cut the roots, and any strong piece of steel would do that. Some military historians argue that the importance of the Rhino device has been overstated. They point out that Operation Cobra also benefited from massive air support, superior artillery, and numerical advantages. The Rhino was just one factor among many. This is also true. The Rhino tank didn't win the Normandy campaign by itself. But it solved a critical problem that had stalled the entire Allied advance for a month. Without the Rhino modification, Operation Cobra would have faced the same hedgerow problems that had plagued earlier offensives. The breakout might have taken weeks longer, cost thousands more casualties, and possibly allowed German reinforcements to stabilize the front. General Bradley believed the Rhino device saved weeks of fighting and thousands of American lives. General Eisenhower called it one of the most important tactical innovations of the war. And German generals, when interviewed after the war, consistently mentioned the American hedgerow-cutting tanks as one of the unexpected developments that made their defensive position in Normandy untenable. The story of the Rhino tank teaches us several important lessons about innovation, warfare, and problem-solving that remain relevant today. First, sometimes the best solutions come from the least expected places. The U.S. Army had professional engineers, MIT graduates, and technical experts working on the blockage problem. None of them solved it. The solution came from a high school dropout who grew up on a Tennessee farm. Culin could solve the problem because his experience was directly relevant in a way that formal engineering education wasn't. He'd spent years dealing with the exact same problem, cutting through tough roots and earth, just in a different context. This reminds us that practical experience and hands-on knowledge can be more valuable than theoretical expertise. The person with the right background knowledge, even if it seems unrelated, might see solutions that experts miss. Second, the story illustrates the power of simple solutions. The Rhino device wasn't sophisticated. It was just steel prongs welded to a tank. But it worked perfectly. Modern military organizations often assume that complex problems require complex solutions. Sometimes they do. But sometimes the best solution is embarrassingly simple, and we overlook it because we're looking for something more sophisticated. The blockage problem seemed like it needed an engineering miracle. The actual solution was something a Tennessee farmer could have built in his barn. Third, the Rhino story shows the importance of experimentation and rapid prototyping. Culin didn't write a proposal and submit it through official channels. He didn't wait for approval from engineers. He just built the thing, tested it, and showed people it worked. In modern military terminology, we'd call this agile development or rapid prototyping. Build quickly, test immediately, iterate based on results. Culin did this in 1944 without knowing the terminology. He just knew that showing beats telling, that a working prototype is more convincing than any explanation. Fourth, the story demonstrates the value of field innovation and bottom-up problem solving. The Rhino device wasn't developed in a laboratory or research facility. It was developed by a sergeant in a frontline unit using scrap materials. This kind of field innovation only happens when soldiers feel empowered to experiment and when their ideas are taken seriously by officers. The fact that Culin's design was adopted army-wide within days shows an organizational flexibility that allowed good ideas to spread rapidly regardless of where they came from. Fifth, the Rhino tank reminds us that sometimes the key to victory isn't better weapons, it's removing obstacles. The Sherman tank was adequate in 1944. It didn't need to be redesigned. It just needed a way to get through hedgerows. By solving that single problem, the Rhino device unlocked the Sherman's existing potential. How many other military problems could be solved not by developing new weapon systems, but by removing the obstacles that prevent existing systems from working effectively? Finally, the story illustrates how tactical innovations can have strategic consequences. The Rhino device was a small-scale tactical modification, just some steel welded to individual tanks. But it enabled Operation Cobra, which led to the Normandy breakout, which led to the liberation of France, which contributed to Germany's defeat. A Tennessee farmer's simple idea, multiplied across thousands of tanks, changed the course of World War II in Europe. Curtis Culin returned home after the war and lived quietly until his death in 1963. He never sought fame or fortune from his invention. He reportedly told people it was no big deal and that anybody could have thought of it. But the thousands of American soldiers who survived the Normandy breakout, the French civilians who were liberated weeks earlier than they might have been, and the German soldiers who were defeated in part because their hedgerow defenses suddenly became useless, all of them owed something to a farm boy from Tennessee who looked at a stuck tank and thought, "That's just like a stuck tractor back home." Sometimes the most important innovations come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes genius is just seeing that your old problem is the same as your new problem. And sometimes a simple piece of welded steel can change the world.